Tuesday work, we're working on grammar, page 104. 104, dependent and independent clauses. So make sure you have your packet ready to go. We're going to do this together. There's only 6 problems. We're going to read the top square together, and then we'll go through the bottom ones. We'll read them all and do them together. If you want to move on, once you know how to do it, you can, but please read the box with me and make sure that you know how to do it, okay? But if you want to go through 1 through 6 with me while I read through them, that's totally fine too. Dependent and independent clauses. So let's start reading in the box together. A complex sentence is made up of a dependent clause and an independent clause. A dependent clause begins with a subordinating conjunction and needs the rest of the sentence to make sense. An independent clause can stand on its own. Before we look at the example, let's think about this for just a minute. Let's think about independent and dependent. You are in 5th grade, and you're kind of at this point where sometimes you can stay home alone if it's for short periods of time, because you can be independent. You can be alone sometimes and you'll be safe and it works out just fine. You're independent, right? You got this. And a lot of times in our class we do independent work, all on our own. Sometimes we have to be dependent though. We have to depend on other people. If you have little brothers and sisters, they depend on you sometimes to babysit them, but they can't be on their own. They can't be on their own. They have to depend on your parents or you to be with them, right? So when we're talking about clauses, and that's just a chunk of a sentence, okay? The dependent clause means it can't be a sentence all on its own. It can't be by itself, just like little kids, right? They can't be on their own. So a dependent clause is part of a sentence that if I read it by itself, it can't be a sentence all on its own. It depends on another part of the sentence to have it make sense. But an independent clause can be on its own. It can work on its own. When I read it, it can be a sentence all by itself. Let's take a look at the example and see if that makes sense to you. I'm going to read right here at our example. This is the dependent clause. When it started to rain. Think about that for just a minute. When it started to rain. Could that be a sentence all on its own? When it started to rain. What? What happens after that, right? When it started to rain, that's not a sentence all on its own. Let's look at the next part, the independent clause. We went inside. Now that could be a sentence. I could write, we went inside. And that could be a sentence all on its own. So that one is independent. It doesn't rely on anything else to be a sentence all by itself. So we're going to take a look at these complex sentences that are at the bottom. Complex, remember, means that it has a dependent clause and an independent clause, and they're together in this one sentence. We're going to circle the dependent clause, just like in the example, and we're going to underline the independent clause. That's the part that can be a sentence all on its own. Now, the dependent clause usually will have the subordinating conjunctions that we talked about yesterday. And if we look at those, they are if, because, when, while, and although, since, after. Those are a few of them. So remember those words, and if you have to look back yesterday, you can, because remember we highlighted them, so we can look back. Okay, so let's read number 1. We boarded up the windows because a hurricane was coming. Okay, so I'm going to break up my sentence right here. Here's my line. This is the first part. This is the second part. So remember, the independent part can be a sentence all on its own. Let's see which one is independent. We boarded up the windows, or because a hurricane was coming. I think that I got a random hair tickling my face. We boarded up the windows. That can be a sentence all on its own. So that is an independent clause. But listen to the next part. Because a hurricane was coming. That is a dependent clause. That cannot be a sentence all on its own. And it has that subordinating conjunction in it. So we circle the dependent clause, which is that last part right there. And we underline the independent clause, which is the beginning right there. Let's try another one together. Remember, you can pause this anytime if you need to, or you can rewind anytime if you need to. After we were finished, we went to the store for supplies. Here is the break in our sentence right here. Put that line right there. That will help us. So the first part says, after we were finished. After we were finished, what? Can that be a sentence all on its own? No. You need something more to make it make sense, right? After we were finished, right? So it's not a complete sentence. So that is our dependent clause. We circle it. Which means that the next part should be our independent clause, which means, remember, it can stand on its own. It can be a sentence on its own. Let's read it and make sure. We went to the store for supplies. Yeah, right? It can be independent, all on its own. You got it. So we underline that second part. Right there. We underline this part. Okay, let's do number 3. Because the storm could knock down power lines, we bought flashlights. Well, I see one of those subordinating conjunctions, because, right? And I see that in the beginning. Because the storm could knock down power lines. And usually the subordinating conjunction goes with the dependent clause. Okay, so I'm going to break up my sentence right here. And this is the part that says, because the storm could knock down power lines. And when I hear that, because the storm could knock down power lines, I know that that's not a complete sentence on its own. It can't be, because it starts with because, and it doesn't end, right? We don't know what happens. Right? So that is our dependent clause. We circle that part, because the storm could knock down power lines. And then the rest of that, we bought flashlights. We bought flashlights. Could that be a sentence all on its own? Yes, so that's our independent clause, and we underline that. We bought flashlights. I'm going to do one more with you, and then you can do the last 2 on your own, because I know you can do it. Number 4, we wanted to hurry back before the storm started. I'm going to put that break, and it might be hard right now for you guys to decide where that break is in the sentence, but this one is going to be right here. Okay, so the first part says we wanted to hurry back, and the next one says before the storm started. We wanted to hurry back. Could that be a sentence all on its own? Sure, yeah, it's got a subject, it's got a verb. We wanted to hurry back. So that's the independent clause. So independent we underline. And then let's just make sure that this last part is the dependent clause. Well, it does start with this joining word, before the storm started. Before the storm started what? Right? That's not a complete sentence on its own, so it's independent, can't stand on its own. We circle it. We circle it. There you go. Try the last 2 on your own. I know you got this.